Testing. Доброго вечора. Вітаю вас. Дивлюся, молоді люди, аж занадто молоді. Так дехто ще не дійшов до віку, що можна купити пиво. Може, я помиляюся? Так? Переважно студенти, так? Всі студенти руку вгору. Вау! Супер! А хто знає англійську мову? Руки вгору. Вау! English speakers. Окей, так що перекладача не потрібно, так? Можемо перейти на англійську мову? Можемо? Так? Добре. We will switch to English. Okay. I don't have words to express the joy and the thrill of all of us being here together this evening to greet Professor Roger Myerson, Nobel Prize Laureate, year 2007. My joy is boundless, not only because we will all have the privilege of hearing him, listening to him, thinking about what he says, even asking questions. But my joy is boundless also because Professor Myerson knows about Ukraine, has invested time in learning about Ukraine, and is offering us a lot of very helpful and useful suggestions. To get Ukraine out of its mess, and it's been in this mess, some say 20 years, and some will say 100 years, and some will say 350 years. We all know those historic benchmarks. We can't do it ourselves. We need the finest minds from all over the world. We need the best benchmarks, the best experience from all over the world that's relevant for us in order to get out of this mess. We should get rid of the illusion that we can get out of this mess the Ukrainian way. That somehow, as we're a subspecies of the human race, and nothing works here. Nothing works here, except whatever we invent ourselves. I think for those of us that have been in many countries, we know that we're all human beings. And societies are similar among themselves. They have differences. But the basic structures that work and provide success are the same all over the world. We know it works and we know it doesn't work. And we have been uniquely successful for the last 20 years of picking that which does not work and avoiding, ignoring, and being afraid of that which works. You're young people. We're building this country for you. There'll be a time when many of us will be gone. We may be up there looking at you. But this will be your country. Take it very seriously. You'll inherit it. Even if you don't want to, it'll be your inheritance. Get ready for it. You're the future elite of Ukraine, and you need to be ready. Being here tonight is a watershed. You came, and many didn't. You'll learn something which they will never know. And you've shown a commitment, and you've shown an eagerness which I think distinguishes you from everyone else. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for finding the time. Thank you very much. A little bit about how we're all here. The Kyiv School of Economics, I think you know. This is the best graduate economics faculty in Ukraine. No joking. We have, all of our professors are Western PhDs, and almost all of them are Ukrainians. We have graduated 600. It's not a big number, but they're the best. Out of the 600, 100 have Western PhDs, and 50 are studying in doctoral programs all over the world. Some of them have come back here. And now that the new law on higher education recognizes PhDs, I think many, many more Ukrainians will come back to Ukraine because they will be recognized. I once joked, and I was quoted in the media, what a strange system we have in Ukraine where PhDs are not recognized. I said, imagine if we could bring the best Nobel Prize winners to Ukraine. And guess what? They wouldn't be recognized. Their PhDs wouldn't be recognized here. If they wanted to teach, they would have to nostrify their PhDs before professors, doctors of science who've never been out of the country, who can't speak a word of another language, who can't read a single article in English or French or German. Disgusting. We've changed that. We've broken that. And so I think many PhDs will come back. Also, Vox Ukraine is here. This is an organization that was formed in February, on February 24th of this year, representing the voice of the economics profession, representing analysis, representing policy advice, articles, blogs, hot advice for hot issues. We're happy to say that out of the key members, most of them are either graduates of KSC or professors at KSC. And this is now an international voice, heard all over the world, representing Ukraine as an economics, as a developed economic science country. You probably know that out of the 15 best Ukrainian economists outside of Ukraine, 13 are either graduates or professors or associated in some way with KSC. And you probably have seen that the best articles in economics written in Ukraine by far are by our professors. So with all of that, thank you for being here, and I welcome Professor Roger Myerson.
It's a great privilege to be here, to be the guest of the Kiev School of Economics. Let me say, in genuine acknowledgement of my hosts, that I have known for some years that the Kiev School of Economics is an important source of talent in my field. When I do doctoral admissions, I watch for graduates of this school, and when I go to conferences and I learn that people who have done interesting, important work are graduates of this school, I know, and that's not surprising. You come from an important place. This school is serving its students well and serving the profession well, and this is a beautiful city, and I was very pleased to be here today for the first time. But I knew one of the first things I wanted to do. There are many beautiful things to see in Kiev, but to me, the pilgrimage to the Kiev School of Economics was what was really most important. And then we can go see beautiful churches and great squares. I should also say that it's been 7 years since I had a conversation. First had a conversation with someone who had told me he had worked on writing the Constitution of Ukraine as an outside consultant, and I expressed enormous concern about what the provisions that he told me about these, and became concerned about the form of centralization in this country's constitution. And about 3 years ago, I wrote a piece in response to something Yulia Tymoshenko had written in Al Jazeera. It was just a personal blog statement. I worked very hard writing it, which wasn't surprising to me that it had attracted any attention. But with the events this year, the basic questions of constitutional reform and other reforms in this country have acquired an importance for this country, I understand. And it's been a privilege to work with Timothy Milovanov. He got me. He gets the blame for encouraging me to correspond with him. Our correspondence became very intense. We started writing things and posting them publicly. I'm an economist. I'm an economic theorist. I'm a foreigner, and I'm going to. I'll get to the first. I've got 7 slides or so, and there's a slide there that starts with some observations from history in America, England and America. I'm an American citizen, and I want to start there because I want to show you you know that I come with a foreign perspective, a foreign prejudice, and then a mathematical analytical perspective, and I should start with that. Although when I say I'm an American and I have an American political perspective, where it talks about medieval English government, my ancestors were in this part of the world then, and they only came from Romania and Lithuania and Poland to America around 130 years ago. But obviously, so when I say take inspiration from history, I've got a note to myself. There is an excellent but little-known book by Jacek Jedruch, Jedruch, Jacek Jedruch, on the details of the history of the legislatures of Poland during the Polish Republic, which dates from about 1595 to 1795, and of which much of this country was a part of that. And I take inspiration from those histories. I'm speaking now to you to try to say something about the life of an economic theorist. Economics, at some point a generation ago, or 50 years ago, might have been defined as being about the allocation of goods, of material resources within a price system. But you should know I'm a game theorist, and game theory is about analysis of incentives in any kind of general organization, so that I have argued that if you look at the origin of the word economics in the Economicus, written by Xenophon about 270 BC, an ancient Greek philosopher, that the origin of the word economics and its modern use today is more about understanding incentives in any kind of institution, incentives in firms, in markets, but also political systems. And obviously, anyone who cares whether about economics or politics understands the interaction of both. You want it. Our market is influenced by the legal and political environment, and our politics are influenced by what pressure groups from different industries and industrialists and economic interests, of course. But all of them, it's not just that they're related to each other, but that politics and economics are about people competing. Firms competing for profits, politicians competing for power. And so we economists at the Kiev School of Economics, at the University of Chicago, and everywhere in between, we try to think deeply and carefully about how competitive systems work, and how they work badly, and how they can be made to work better. How can we reform the structure of an institution in order to give people incentives which will then enable them all to live together better and more productively and more with greater welfare for a larger number of people. That's what market reform is about. That's what political reform should be about. The great questions in this country today that should include, I believe, political reform. Let me say, I am very aware that to be in a country where on part of the frontier there's violent conflict that has in question whether this country will continue to exist as a sovereign nation with the recognized boundaries. That question is a question about the survival and the continuation of a political entity. We're talking about the sovereign nation of Ukraine as a political entity. Any political reform that gives greater confidence to people that the government in the long run, the political system of Ukraine will lead to politicians and political leaders who serve the country better. Anything that does that will increase people's willingness to make real sacrifices in defense of the country. And in that sense, political reform is as important as anything else in one of the most important events that anyone can live through. So there are huge questions here, but I want to encourage you to think of them as questions about the design of a system. When I talk specifically about constitutional reform, in almost every country, wherever constitutional reforms have happened, they have been led by political leaders, and political leaders have said, politicians are going to think, under the reform system, what offices will be won by me and by those, by those whom I like, those my allies, and I would like the reform to maximize the power of those offices. That's what we should expect, and because if those of us who believe in the power of incentives, but obviously that's not going to optimize for that's not, whatever they're thinking, that's not about the long-term welfare of the country, because a constitution should be a document that should give a structure to political competition for decades and hopefully generations. And the real question should be, how would we reform the structure of our country? If we were going to reform the structure of our political system in any particular way, how should we do it so as to get the best possible leaders 50 years from now, and so as to give the politicians of our country an incentive to serve the people as well as possible? I want to say to you that's an economic theory question. It's an economic theory or a political theory question, and it's the kind of thing we study at the Kiev School of Economics, at the University of Chicago, in political science and economics departments, and the citizens of this country, whatever the answer is, that it is something we have to think about. But that's the question, and we need to, and constitutional questions should be asked with respect to the long term, and that's why an academic discussion or debate is useful. Let me just say one other thing important before I start. The questions of this country in a time of trouble are the most important thing we could possibly, any one of us. I'm here because there's nothing more important to talk about than questions that are currently being considered in a great nation that could really make a difference to the welfare of people in the future. I think within the living memory of everyone in this room, the questions of transition from a communist system to a system with a free market and with multi-party democracy is a huge question that helps to understand both systems, and the transition between them requires a conceptual structure that is more general and deeper than from Adam Smith to David Ricardo to Paul Samuelson, really. Economics was developed largely in response to the questions of a very narrow kind of human organization, the institutions of the market and the legal institutions and the political questions of Western Europe and North America, obviously. If we look in history, if we look at very different systems, if we look at great transitions, we are forced to have a more fundamental theory. And it's in that sense I have long looked to the former Soviet bloc area as a source of important talent that would enrich and deepen the discussions, our understanding of economic theory, of social theory. And so now, with that, now we get to work on telling you some things that I think are important and that happen to be, I think, perhaps involved in questions here in Ukraine. But this is a Kiev School of Economics academic lecture in another hall. And so I will not give you any formulas, but I'm going to try to talk logically about and give arguments about the consequences of different structures. So here I have, I'm telling you this is my English, Anglo-American political heritage slide, in which I want to tell you something about where I think the great power of England and the great power of the United States. I want to say in one slide something about that fundamentally it has to do with decentralized political structures in those countries. If you read, as I have for inspiration, in detail, the historians writing about medieval English history, going back to William the Conqueror at least, one thing you find, historians writing about England around 1200 will tell you that the the rise to England to be a great power, a strong state after William the Conqueror, really begins with the court of the Exchequer. The finance minister in England is now known as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so you should know that Exchequer has something to do with money. It's about finance and accounting. The word exchequer actually comes from a checkerboard tablecloth in which they did the accounts. They would pass the tokens across the checkers. And we have a document that exists, the Dialogue of the Exchequer from 1190 AD, in which he says they're doing the accounts by pushing the tokens across this checkerboard, but just as at a checkerboard there are two people playing chess or checkers who are in a big conflict, so the Exchequer is about a conflict between, and I want to pause for a moment to let you guess who are the two parties who are in conflict at the checkerboard. And the answer that he gives, Fitznagel, the author of the Dialogue of the Exchequer from 1190, the reign of Henry II of England, his answer is, it is the treasurer and the sheriff. The sheriff, first of all, it's really a governor, provincial governor. The word sheriff is the English word, but it's the provincial governor who is a representative of the government of the king's government in the provinces, and the treasurer who is a representative of the central government, and they are sitting to do accounts. The Exchequer was an institution in which every time a provincial governor, twice a year, a provincial governor would sit down with the representative of the central government to keep track of all the tax revenue that was being brought in and all of the legal orders that the governor had been carrying out. And why are they doing that? Because the king sometimes has to fire a sheriff, a governor. He controls England only through his governors, and yet sometimes he has to dismiss them, and I'll talk a little bit about why there's tension of that. So when there's grounds for dismissing a governor, the king needs it to be completely public. And so let me just say, the Exchequer is an institution for public accounting of transactions between the national and provincial governments. The Parliament originates about 100 years later, in 1300. It was not, when it began, it was not popular election like Parliament is today. It was not a mass democratic institution. It was bringing the representatives of the town governments and the local gentry who at the village level were running the government of England and giving them a national voice, bringing representatives together of the local governments in what was, of course, a monarchy, a hereditary monarchy. It was not a democratic state. But by giving the representatives of local government throughout England a chance to send representatives together to complain about abuse of power by the national government, the balance of power between the national government and the local governments, that is, the highest level of the national government, some representatives of the highest level of the national government, such as captains of the king's army who were trying to get resources, would sometimes expropriate the resources of the local gentry who were trying to, who the king relied on to run the village, to raise taxes from the towns and villages. And since the people who were closer to the king could steal from people who were not so close to the king, and by bringing the representatives together, they could guarantee the privileges of the local government better. And by guaranteeing a certain redistribution of power from the highest level of the Kingdom of England to the lower levels, they got better service. They enlarged the number of people on the English island who felt that they had a genuine politically protected stake in the machinery of the king's government. England became a stronger country, and I would argue it's from that date that England begins to invade France, which was and is a physically larger country, more populous, and then had a much larger estimated GDP. But because the King of England was giving power to representatives of local governments, let me say, Edward I was the king who created Parliament, really. His son, Edward II, was overthrown in a coup that had support from Parliament. So right away, Parliament became a thorn in the side of some leading monarchs. And so it was a genuine sacrifice, but England overall was stronger because of a decentralization of power that made it, because more people had a stake in the country. So that's an introduction. I should say, in the development of England, the Turnpike Trusts, the Industrial Revolution begins with England getting the world's best transportation system, and that began with Turnpike Trusts, which were deals between where the local, around in the 1700s, where local government officials improved roads, charged tolls, but the tolls had to be nationally regulated. And the fact that the local governments were represented in Parliament was absolutely essential to the fact that there could be trust that improvements of roads by local officials would not be expropriated by the national government, because the local officials had a voice in the light. So I want to argue the Industrial Revolution depended intrinsically on the power sharing between local and national government that was of the essence of the matter in England's parliamentary system. The United States had decentralized democracy for 100 years before we elected at least in every part of the 150 in some parts, before the United States elected its first president in 1790. The decentralized democracy, where there was not decentralized democracy in the United States, where provincial assemblies didn't exist, the local county level militias that were essential to defending the frontier against the Indians became disloyal. And so it was essential to have mass representation to make sure the government maintained the loyalty of the local militias. I would argue that the American Revolution succeeded because the decentralized nature of the American political system from the beginning guaranteed that in every community there was at least one local big shot, the local representative in the provincial assembly, who had a strong vested interest in the revolutionary regime. There were plenty of people who preferred staying loyal to the British Empire, but that decentralized political distribution of power in America, although very inconvenient for raising funds for George Washington's army, was essential, I would argue, to the success of the broad-based political support that made the revolution unbeatable. And finally, the establishment of competitive democracy at the national level depended essentially on the fact that before America began its national republican system, there were already people with good reputations for responsible representative public service all across at the local level. In fact, the second president of the United States passed a sedition act that was essentially trying to make it a one-party state and making opposition to the president illegal, a crime. And several of the provinces, which we call states in America, objected and prevented that. So, okay, let's move on. Theory, 2 theoretical slides. I want to share with you an economic theorist's perspective on the foundations of government. So I have 2 slides with no equations, but in which I want to try to, I have a lot of words, too many words probably, but I'll talk through them. Talk about 2 papers. One paper from 2008 in the American Political Science Review, The Autocrat's Credibility Problem and the Foundations of the Constitutional State. I guess I want to simply point out what parts, this is a Kiev School of Economics event, so I want to point out what parts of economic theory I think are fundamental to understanding constitutionalism and use some jargon words of economic theory. For example, agents in a firm may look to state courts for contract enforcement. But in a political faction that aims to take power in the state itself, under any political system, power at the highest level is going to be won by politicians who have groups of supporters. They organize factions. A political leader needs to mobilize support to win votes, or if it's in a democracy, or in other ways in any political system, those who take power need broad support behind them. Not necessarily a majority of the population if you're not having an election, but you need support. How do you organize that support? If I want to organize a company and I hire you and I sign a contract with you and then I break the contract and I don't pay you, you could perhaps sue me in your country's courts. But if I'm asking you to join a political faction that's going to take power and then I break faith with you, there is no court. There is no higher court for adjudicating disputes within a political faction itself. So we have to ask the question, political institutions are established by recognized leaders who can motivate a network of active supporters. Those supporters are needed to win power and also to wield it. No monarch has ever run a country on his own. He needs people to work for him. Any leader needs a reputation for reliably distributing patronage benefits to his loyal supporters. That, to me, is the fun. In this APSR, American Political Science Review article from 2008, I argue that that is the fundamental political law. That's a rather frightening thing because nobody wants to talk about that. We have recognized that there's corrupt patronage, but if it is those who hold power must inspire some people to work actively for them, to get out the vote or to do whatever it takes to win the battle, the struggles for power. And those other supporters will only support if they think that after winning power, something good will be done for them. How does the leader commit to that? The state is a network of agents who could profit from abuse of power. And so if they're going to use their power for the goals of the people or for any other goals that the leadership sets, they have to expect greater long-term rewards from good service, and the technical term is moral hazard rents in the economic theory literature. And I should note that, of course, people would pay for such offices. Being appointed to be the mayor or governor of an important city or province could be very profitable, and if I have money, I might like to pay for the right to do that. Promises of backloaded late career rewards become a debt that is owed by the state, which its leaders could be tempted to repudiate and resell the office to someone else. So, as in any organization, the state is an organization of individuals who will have some power as agents of the government, and to convince them to behave in any way other than to abusing that power for their own personal profit requires some guarantee that if they act well and can maintain a good record, that they will have some long-term benefits of being part of the government. But we want it to be late in their careers and conditional on standard agency models show that it's better to give late career rewards because late career rewards can motivate good behavior throughout your career. But then that requires an ability of the political leadership to commit to long-term promises. So political leaders must somehow guarantee, before they can guarantee anything else, we hope in a democracy that the political leaders are going to tell us that they are going to mobilize the agents of the state to provide good public services to the people. But before they can make those promises, they have to somehow control the agents of the state. And in order to that, they have to somehow convince the agents of the state not to abuse their power. Threatening prison terms for corruption is one thing, but there are some. But you don't want people to think there's a risk of going to prison when you volunteer to work for the government. And sometimes we're going to get it wrong. So some part of the rewards have to not be threats, but promises of great long-term rewards. But who can bind the leader who wields the sovereign power of the state? And the answer I want to argue is his or her supporters together have such power if any violation of constitutional norms would cause them to lose that trust. Remember, the reputations, so let me say what I did in this paper was argued that the reputational power, the power of the leader to bind himself to his supporters is greater if cheating any one supporter would cause all the supporters to lose faith, lose trust. And for that, the leader really wants to create institutions in which he can be overthrown. He can make a binding commitment because they strengthen the leader's power to make long-term promises. In that sense, for example, parliamentary democracies typically have stronger governing coalitions than presidential democracies. And the reason is because the backbench members of the parliament, at any time, if a prime minister starts breaking his political promises, he can be overthrown. Whereas a president who's been elected to a fixed term cannot be trusted as much to maintain his political promises because the temptation to behave presidentially is always there. So actually, presidential governments typically have weaker coalitions behind them than parliamentary governments. Well, so I want to argue that the foundations of all constitutional laws may ultimately depend on their leaders' fragile reputations for reliably rewarding their supporters' loyal service. That was the argument of the American Political Science Review article, and it was an argument that constitutional norms depend on saying if a leader who suddenly behaves unconstitutionally, people would say, you're behaving differently now, and now we don't trust you to continue to also take good care of us, those who have worked for you. Now let me get to federalism. The second technical paper I'd like to talk around, to tell you about without showing you any formulas, is in the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, 2006. It's a game model, and its title is Federalism and Incentives for Success of Democracy. I'm going to publicly admit here, in the discussions, as I participate in discussions about decentralization in Ukraine, I have been warned that people want to talk about decentralization and not federalism. Those words, I'm speaking English, and all those conversations have been in English. I do not really understand any Ukrainian who would prefer me to say decentralization than federalism. I'm happy to say that in general, but you should know I don't know the difference in the meaning between the two words. Or if I do, it's not what you care about. So I'm going to say federalism now. And if you like, it means the same as almost the same as decentralization. Yes. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I would like to comment. I'll comment in English and then in Ukrainian as well. This is indeed a problem for Ukraine, for the terminology. There is a notion that federalization, which is, for instance, suggested by Russia, is somehow conceptually different from decentralization, which is suggested by the president as a solution to the crisis, for instance. And it's very difficult to find people in the West who would understand the distinction. We have run in multiple difficulties during the presentations and press conferences and roundtables where representatives from the West would use the terminology federalization, because there is no such a word, decentralization. It doesn't really have a different meaning. And then these people would be perceived as advocating a Russian position. So now I will repeat that in Ukrainian. В Україні є різниця між децентралізацією та федералізацією. Вважається, що федералізація – це щось зовсім інше, що воно пропонується нашим сусідам не задля нашої користі. Але децентралізація – це щось дуже гарне, що воно пропонується державою задля нашої користі. І коли ми постійно, коли розмовляємо, ми постійно стикаємося з проблемами, що іноземці не розуміють різниці. Їм все одно, це все рівно федералізація. Ми розмовляємо про те, щоб віддати більше влади на місцях, і це федералізація. Вони можна назвати децентралізацією, можна казати про фіскальну федералізацію, можна казати про якусь іншу, про деталі, але немає різниці. Термінології немає на Заході різниці між федералізацією і децентралізацією. Хочу, щоб ми тут розуміли, що люди розмовляють про щось, що вони самі не розуміють, в чому різниця. І тому, коли Роджер Майерсон каже федералізм, він не має, це не російська позиція.
Having raised, I'll now say, I think, and I don't want to argue about it, but I think political scientists in America, at least, would say, in the Constitution of Ukraine today, constitutional amendments, there are constitutional provisions that talk about provincial and local and district government. oblast and rayon government. However, the Constitution can be amended simply by, in 2 sessions, a vote of the Verkhovna Rada. That is to say, the National Assembly of Ukraine can amend the Constitution at any time without requiring any approval by the oblast. That means, as long as that remains true, any decentralization would be called decentralization, and it would become federalism when the Constitution itself requires specific approval of the provinces to be amended. If that's important, fine. But I think that's not the central of, anyway. I've tried to argue that we should see leaders' political reputations as the social capital of state on which our states are built. That's really what I was trying to argue before. And we should understand, I was trying to say that any leader needs to inspire the loyalty of an active faction of political supporters. And so even a benevolent autocrat would find it hard to resist his supporters' urge for more privileges if greater exploitation of the public would entail no risk of losing power. What I'm saying there is we should look at a political faction as being like a profit-maximizing firm, where profits mean taking benefits of privileges of power at the expense of the general public and giving greater material consumption benefits to the faction. A monarch might eventually be able to take with just a tiny fraction of the national GDP, might be able to enjoy such a high standard of living that he or she might need nothing more. But the monarch doesn't govern the country by him or herself. Tens or hundreds of thousands of active supporters are needed, and those people economists think of as selfish materialists who would like to have greater consumption, and that is at the expense of everyone else. And their desire for greater privileges is central to the life of the leader, the monarch, even a benevolent monarch, who needs to retain power. So when I said more exploitation of the public would entail no risk of losing power, I want you to think of a demand curve. The price, how much corrupt profit-taking are we going to take from the public for elite privileges? That's the price axis. And what is the probability that 5 years from now we'll still be in power, whether because we're re-election or because the people rise up in revolt or something? That's the expected demand. That's the demand for our public services in the future. Monopolists don't raise the price to infinity because they realize as they raise the price, there's a probability of the expected demand for their output reduces. And if there were no reduction in demand, they would keep raising the price to infinity. Similarly, corruption is bounded by a perception that, I'm sorry, dear faction, the monarch says, but if I allow you even more privileges, we may risk losing power. I'm sorry, there is no multi-party competition in China today, but I think the Communist Party of the People's Republic of China still remembers from Tiananmen Square around 1989 that there might be some threat to their continued rule, and I think they are motivated to limit the advantages of power by a perception of an elasticity of demand, a possibility that if we are too greedy, we may not keep power. But obviously, democratic competition is meant to be about that. That to make explicit that there is not just one oligarchy. What is democracy? Democracy might be saying that there are multiple oligarchic networks. Those are political powers, and they have to compete for power, and all of the rest of us get to cast votes on election day, and we decide which oligarchic network will supply power and will control the power of our country. That's what the theory of democracy is. So when you come from economic theory, studying in the Kiev School of Economics or elsewhere, you are trained to study markets and ask questions about whether imperfectly competitive markets will have high prices like monopoly or low prices like a perfectly competitive market. How many firms does it take and what structures of the markets will create enough competition to reduce profit-taking below monopoly. Obviously, the theory of democracy is by an analog with that. The people, I am not a government official, I'm just a professor. I'm a privileged individual as a professor, but I'm not part of the circle of power in my country, and certainly not in yours. So I want to know, I want those people who control power to use most of that power to serve all of us in the public. I like it in particular when they make it, serve higher education, but never mind the interests of higher education, but we all have our biases. Will competition work? Obviously, the theory of democracy is it's not going to be the theory of monarchy is it's a monopoly, and I look at a system that says we will have one enlightened vanguard of the proletariat that has a monopoly on power. If the theory is that those people can become not selfish materialists but can be taught to love justice, as Lenin advocated and as Plato advocated in antiquity, then perhaps we don't need competition. But we economists are methodologically biased towards a sense that nobody can be taught to be perfect, not university professors, and although I think politicians tend to be at least as public-oriented as anyone, I think selfishness is a safe assumption. So I'm going to tell you about a model, at least a little bit about a model that assumes, I think the word virtue is down there. Down there, virtue rare, it has my QJPS, it says virtue rare. I want to tell you the technical details of my model is I assume that we have potential political leaders and that most of them are selfish materialists who simply want to maximize their expected profits from ruling, and they can either rule corruptly or benevolently. If they act in a benevolent way and serve the people, they get some benefits of power, but if they act corruptly, they get greater benefits of power. And it's and most are normal people who prefer corrupt. But on the other hand, they'd also like to stay in power. So we're going to have democracy in the model. And all the voters have the same interests in having good non-corrupt rule, so we can just really have one voter, I'll assume, one representative voter who decides, who's drawn out of the Maidan Square to say, shall we re-elect the president or not? And of course they all have the same interest, everyone in the square, and he will give the answer. So I'm going to assume that democracy exists, and that the truth is, to tell you about the technical details, I assume there is a very small, the technical number is epsilon, a small probability that any randomly sampled individual is actually a virtuous person who does not want to be corrupt but simply wants to serve the public. But I'm going to assume that those are rare people, very rare. Will democracy work? I've said something about the model, but let me back off from it and look at these words here and follow my words for a moment. It is a question that is good. We should look at theoretical models, and can I prove to you that once we have people running for office, competing for office rather than a monopolist, whether by a king or by being the heir of the founder of the ruling party, of the one ruling party, as when we get away from monopoly and allow competitive structure, will competition actually reduce profit-taking by those who control power? The taking of resources for elite privileges rather than using all resources of the state on public service. Okay, will it happen? The answer is not necessarily. So I'm going to describe to you, and in brief, the idea is, voters would not reject a corrupt incumbent unless they could expect better from another candidate. Technically, in my model, I assumed that there was a small transition cost, and that transition cost could mean actually throwing out the incumbent leader involves some risk when you vote against him, because maybe you might get arrested, or perhaps you simply know that if you elect someone else, he might be completely crazy. And at least you know the current leader isn't one of those crazy people, and a crazy person would be worse than a normally corrupt person. So there's some transition cost. It's a small transition cost. Small but bigger than the probability of finding an honest person at random. All right. So voters would not reject a corrupt incumbent unless they could expect better from another candidate. So I want to argue that successful democracy depends on an ample supply of leaders who have reputations for using public resources to serve the public and not just to give patronage jobs. In my very strongly democratic country with a long history of democracy, our elected leaders still use resources to give patronage jobs, but they insist that the patronage jobs the people who get those jobs should actually provide some public service as well. So my point is, how are we going to raise expectations? Democracy may fail if people is maybe frustrated, even when it exists, but it provides no benefits because the voters all look at the current corrupt leader and they say, why vote for anyone else? He would be just as bad. And now the corrupt leader knows that he can be corrupt and not lose power. And so, of course, he's going to be corrupt because he's a normal person, unless we happen to have, by luck, one of those virtuous people. The goal of a competitive system is to get normal people to act like saintly, virtuous people. That's our goal. Then competitive incentives work. Promises of better government are not credible from one who has never held power. People out of power are very good at making speeches. Elect me as your leader, and I will not be corrupt. I will use the government to serve you. That speech has been heard before. You just heard it from me. Don't vote for me. I have never had controlled billions of public money and not stolen it, so you have no reason to believe me. I may be a nice professor, but don't believe me as a leader. An incumbent leader at the top has no incentive to raise voters' expectations. So how do we combine? The argument I want to make at basic is that the opportunity to begin to raise expectations, that some of us can provide better public services, and I'm one of them. The costly signal, you can only do that if you have a costly signal, if you actually have a public budget that you control and you don't steal the money. That opportunity can be combined with an incentive to actually do it, only if you have public budgets in the hands of some independent, some autonomous part of government that isn't the highest part of government. Because once you've reached the top, you have no incentive to convince people. If the voters believe that everybody would steal, then you have no incentive to change that once you're at the top. You might as well just steal like they expect, and they're not going to throw you out. So subnational government. So now, what I did was I set up a model with some parameters that I've described briefly, such that if you had a unitary state, there's a good equilibrium in which the voters think that nobody would steal, and therefore if anybody steals, they throw them out and bring in the next person. And so every normal politician knows that when he's in power, he'd better not steal or be thrown out. So that's a good equilibrium. But there's also a bad equilibrium in which the voters think, oh, anybody we bring to power would steal, unless he's a saint, and that's so unlikely, and there is a transition cost, and therefore we might as well stay with the person we have, and therefore the normal person in power steals. So I've set up a unitary model, so that if there were only one level of government, that person, you could have a good equilibrium, democracy works, but you could also have a bad equilibrium and democracy doesn't work. And then we say, supposing we have two levels of government. Everything's the same in both levels of government, except that the benefits and the costs, the benefits are greater when you become president than when you are a governor of when you become president of the nation than when you are governor of a province. Can you have if each one of those levels was alone, you could have the bad equilibrium in each. But you cannot have the bad equilibrium in both. Why? Because if you have the bad equilibrium in both, no governor would ever not steal unless he were a saint. But if he were a saint, a virtuous saint, then you would want to elect him president. But if you were a governor, a new governor, you would prefer to be elected president. So that's not a Nash equilibrium of our game. People would start deviating and pretending to be better than they are. Now, I'm not going to describe the full equilibrium because there are multiple equilibria, and there are equilibria where some people pretend to be good governors and then perhaps get to be president, and then they start cheating on us. My point is, at least once we have some governors pretending to be better than they were, democracy is actually providing some benefits. Because that's the goal, that's the goal of the competitive system, to get people who are selfish materialists to act like they just want to serve the people. And that's the theory. Autonomous, let me give it a different way. In basic economic theory, because I've taken too much time, but I've described I need to stop within 4 minutes. Autonomous, in terms of basic ideas of general economic analysis, autonomous local governments basically are reducing barriers against new political entry into national democratic competition. I have not argued that local government is better than national government. What I've argued is that the existence of local government creates an opportunity for lowers. Let me back up and say, everyone, one of the basic ideas in economic analysis is that in imperfectly competitive markets, the level of profits by the suppliers in the market, it may not be determined by whether there are 2, 3, or 4 firms, but on how difficult it is for new suppliers to enter and compete. If the profit levels are very high, we will bring in new firms if barriers are low, and profits therefore cannot be very high. Whereas if there are high barriers, any small number of firms can begin to collude. So in politics, the level of corruption among 2 or 3 parties, if no new parties can enter, if there's no possibility of new entry into national politics, then any small number of factions could learn to collude with each other and respect each other's corruption and share as they alternate in power, and keep the voters in the bad equilibrium. It's the ability of new entrants to come into national politics. If there are 24 different provinces, each of which has genuine responsible government at the provincial level in Ukraine, for example, then those people who have power are not appointed by the center, and therefore are not. The central government doesn't want new competition from the provinces, but people who have been elected independently now have the opportunity to exceed expectations, show that they can govern a province better, and perhaps become contenders for national political competition. In well-established democracies, regularly, not always, but many competitors for national power are people who proved themselves first by doing better than expected in provincial politics. Narendra Modi who was newly elected Prime Minister of India after doing a very good job as Chief Minister of Gujarat. Ideally, local and provincial governments should form a ladder of democratic political advancement that successful leaders can climb into national politics by providing better public service, which makes local politics, local government better, and national government better. I should say I've argued that I've not tried to say local politics is better. I live in Chicago, which has had a one-party dominated oligarchic government for a long time. But the oligarchs who dominate Chicago's one-party democracy live in the United States of America. They are Democrats, by the way, if you didn't know. But there is also a Republican Party that is important in the United States of America. And if the oligarchic group that dominates Chicago politics lost the genuine support of a large majority of the citizens of Chicago, they could not prevent the Republican Party from supporting a candidate and the votes actually being counted to throw them out of power. So I want to argue that national politics also makes local politics more competitive. What I'm saying is that each level of multiple levels of democracy, from local government, provincial government, to national government, each make all the others more competitive in a variety of ways. There are other reasons why local democracy may be important. I don't have time to talk about local government may be better at mobilizing resources for public investments. But I do want to say at the bottom of the slide that political decentralization can strengthen a state against insurgency, or conversely, I've already argued in the American Revolution, an insurgent government, the United States rebelling against the British, was stronger precisely because it was decentralized. Why? Because rules within a state that require leaders at the top to share power with popularly supported local leaders in every part of the nation guarantee that every region has local leaders who have a proven ability to mobilize residents politically and who have a substantial stake worth defending in the country's political system. That is is clearly relevant to questions today. Electing a leader whose main power is to appoint local government. Oh, this is a model that was inspired by, to the extent that, an oversimplification, but to the extent that the president of Ukraine is an office whose principal power in this parliamentary democracy, the national government is supposed to be run principally by the prime minister who is chosen by the Verkhovna Rada. The popularly elected president, one of his most important powers is to appoint the executive heads of the provincial and district governments. 24 or so provincial government heads, several hundred rayon government heads are to be appointed by the president and are responsible only to the president. To the extent that, let me just describe briefly a simple game model. And the game model is, you are running for president, and let's imagine it's simpler than Ukraine. That's your only main power, is to appoint these local government heads. You don't control the national government policy. That's the prime minister. Do you make a commitment to appoint local government heads who will give good local government service? Or do you look for a powerful supporter who can give you money or foot soldiers for the election and say, support me and I will appoint you to a province, which then you can take as much profit as you like out of that province. The people in that province, of course, will groan under your oppressive rule, but I will sell it to you sell the province to the highest bidder. This is an abstract game model. It's not any one country, but it's a structure. What do you do? The answer, I think, is you do a little of both. In some provinces where you think you might get a lot of votes, you would like to make the commitment to good government, to appointing a governor who you will supervise and make sure he gives good government. To those provinces where you think even if you promise the best government, probably most of them would vote for someone else, don't try to get good votes. Instead, you should sell the province to the highest bidder, to the person who can contribute the most to your campaign, in whatever way. Now, some people in those provinces where most people weren't going to vote for you, some of them might have actually liked you for whatever reason. They were taught at the same school as you, perhaps. But they live in a province where they know that you are going to sell that province because you don't expect much support. And therefore, now even they don't like you. Even they don't want you to be elected. What I'm saying is, when you have an election of a national leader whose principal power is to control separate local governments, you're creating a game whose equilibrium behavior would have candidates spontaneously concentrating their appeal in one place and angering everybody in some other parts of the country. Whoever wins the election then in that equilibrium, there will be large provinces where nobody feels anything but bad about what's just happened in the presidential election, where nobody supports the winner. That is not this world. But if you see a resemblance, what do you do with an economic theory model? You said, this Myerson has just oversimplified. But if there's anything in the constitutional structure of Ukraine that resembles this, if it suggests that some part of there are regional tensions in this country, I read the newspaper and I know that, are some part of those regional tensions generated by politicians responding rationally to incentives that are created by the constitutional rules of the game? If so, one would like to change the rules of the game to avoid that. This is in part of why I intuitively reacted negatively when I was told 7 years ago that this country had a constitution where the president's principal power was to control local governments. Let me say, separatism, obviously devolving local governments, I've just argued that actually decentralization can decrease the incentives for separatism, because it guarantees that every part of the country has someone who has the elected officials, who knows that they have some power in this country, in this region. However, For a large province that could stand alone as a separate nation, its elected leaders might be tempted to cultivate a separatist movement by the thought that it would be more fun to be the president of an independent country than the local government head of a province. However, when power is devolved to smaller districts, that effect is reduced. So, but the most important thing to say is I have argued that the benefits of, theoretically, the benefits of decentralization may be that they make national politics more competitive. Dear students of economics, lowering profits in an industry, making an industry more competitive, is generally not in the interests of competitors. When we have an MBA program at the Kiev School of Economics, one of the things people will do with the theory of barriers to entry is say that firms that want to make high profits should try to find a way of operating in a market where there are high barriers to entry around them. So national political leaders should understand that lowering barriers to entry into national political competition is not in their interest. I hope our national political interest leaders in my country and yours are patriots and want to do, in some sense, in what's best for the country. But they may tell themselves two things. One is concentrating power in the hands of me and my friends, since we really want to do what's good for the country, is going to be good for the country rather than giving it to our adversaries whom we don't trust. But they may also realize in their bones that they are losing power. And certainly, the president of Ukraine under the Constitution has the power to appoint local government heads in provinces and districts. Anyone who ran a serious campaign for president of Ukraine had supporters around him, some of whom were important supporters and therefore might have thought that they were giving their support in hopes that the president would then appoint them as a governor of a province. And those are a small number of people, but some of the most important people. Those people are not going to encourage the president of Ukraine on taking power to give up his power to appoint governors, because they will be disappointed. And it's dangerous for any political leader it's dangerous for any political leader to disappoint such powerful supporters. So political decentralization is often undersupplied because it runs against the vested interest of those who hold power at the national level. That's just a statement about interest and competition. I'm not denigrating the patriotism of anyone. But I do want to argue that federal systems of democracy are also stable. Let me end with this. Are stable once established. Because once there are, in every part of the country, local provincial and district heads and urban heads who are popularly elected, who have a lot of power to spend public funds and have strong patronage networks in a power sharing system. Once that's been established, the people who share power at the provincial and who have power at the provincial and local levels, these become important power brokers who any candidate for national power wants to work with. He wants to get their support. Presidents of the United States have been elected with the help of the mayors of Chicago, for example, who made sure that there were lots of votes in Chicago for their election. And at that time, any candidate for national office who is suspected of wanting to reduce the privileges of local power is in danger of losing some of the most, en masse, the support of some of the most important people in the country. So there's a bistable equilibrium. It's difficult to change from one to the other, but either one once established, and it's at the time of crisis, unfortunately, that such questions may occur. I mustn't say anything else. I'll skip this. I'm sorry. There's my summary slide, but I think I'm over an hour, and we need to allow time for questions, and we can't be here more than 8:30, so I must stop.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, very much. So there is time for questions. Please, if there are any questions in the audience. Yes. There was a question over there.
Hello. If I may, two questions to ask. First one is, you said that decentralization or federalization is a good way to solve this crisis of Ukraine or something else. But at the same time, you said that in the English Empire also granted this power to local authorities. And at the end, these authorities in America have overthrown the English power, right?
Yes.
The
American Revolution was... It's a good question. And by the way, I have tried to study in detail why the British did grant representative assemblies, and I've looked at documents about there's debate on that, and where kings of England opined on whether New York should have a representative assembly. In the end, I think they granted the representative assemblies because when they didn't, as I say, because they had to have a decentralized militia, so the military power was decentralized to the population. And they had to give representation to those. That did not mean representation of all people. Besides the fact that women didn't vote, there was slavery, where half the population in some parts were not politically enfranchised and indeed had no legal rights. But the white males who served, the free white males who served in the militia, where they were not politically empowered, the militias became disloyal. And so it was essential to the. However, the American Revolution's rallying was no taxation without representation. The American provincial assemblies had little or no voice in the imperial political decision making. If Americans had also been enfranchised to vote in England, that one of the questions early on was perhaps we will not have an American Revolution if the English will give to, and this was never seriously considered in England, giving representation, but I should say this time of Britain, because Scotland was then part, but Britain did not seriously consider giving representation in the House of Commons to its Englishmen living in America, and that was what the revolution was about.
Okay. And if I may, a second question. I don't know if somebody told you or not, we have this negative equilibrium in Ukraine at both levels, unfortunately, because if you are not generating cash flow out of bribes or something else, you are not promoted further, because on the higher stage you can just generate more money. So this is the question, how to overthrow this system. And the main question is on your, what's your position? What's the incentive for a normal person to be in politics, to have the power, if not taking some bribes or abuse the power?
Yeah.
Thank you.
The answer, I should say, I described the principal part of my talk was a description of a paper that was an attempt to formally answer your question. So I was creating a simplified world in which you could have a good equilibrium where democracy works well, but a bad equilibrium where everyone expects that anyone who is put in power will be corrupt. No, I changed that. There are some small number of saints or monks who, if we could put but they don't live in a monastery. The monks who are living in a monastery, most of them are normal also. So there are some true saints among us, but it's very hard to find them. When I do that, I needed that in the model, but I think that's not a stupid assumption. When I put that in there, and then I have a large number of people who actually hold power, that is, they're actually, then I show that the possibility of rising to higher office is the motivator that gets the expectations changed. To step outside the model. As long as we're pessimistic about whether anyone would be then they know, the corrupt leaders know that being corrupt is not going to cost them power because the voters are not really interested in political change for its own sake, and are not trusting anyone else. So somewhere we need to find someone whom we really can trust. To really be able to trust them, they have to prove to us that they will not steal a public budget. How else do you do that? By giving some people public budgets. other than those who control the national country, the nation at large. And that's decentralization creates that it creates more opportunities for people to have actual opportunities to have public budgets, and if some of them start not behaving better, then you use the local. It is precisely because local governments are mostly going to be corrupt that the ones who are not corrupt become candidates for higher office. In America, local government is typically, throughout the history of the United States, local governments in most parts of the country have been more corrupt than the corruption we've had at the national level. However, it's precisely because there's so much corruption in our local governments that some of our local leaders who have behaved better have become strong candidates for national leadership, and that has enriched our national competition, which is part of why so you have to, if you're searching for better leaders, having more levels of responsible government, where responsibility means they take credit for the successes and responsibility for the failures, is creating opportunities. That's the argument.
Okay, thanks, Roger. There is another question in the back, and then will be you and you. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Myerson, for the fabulous presentation, and I found it as a good summary of a House of Cards TV show.
Yes.
However, I have a question. Did you add to the study's effect of external threat, or did you analyze any countries that were bordering to the biggest country in the world that wants to be even bigger? And especially your thesis that no decentralization leads to separatism of local elites, because currently, and maybe you've seen it in the news, that it's not always local elites, it's foreign agents that are shipped into the country.
No. You're absolutely right. Foreign intervention perverts, when foreigners are offering resources, if, foreign assistance, there's an attempt to provide, the World Bank is in the business of trying to help encourage better government, but when you look at it, what is the World Bank doing? It's sending money into the hands of politicians, and now are the politicians working really for the people of their country, or are they working for the World Bank? Now I want to mention the World Bank because when they put money in, it should be public. So one of the answers is transparency about foreigners who would genuinely like to help a country and put money into it. Residents of the country should be suspicious, because is this an attempt to influence the country? And the answer is probably it is, whether benevolently or malevolently. But at least it should be public. But if you live next door to a very large country that has a large treasury and is willing to make secret cash donations to one politician or another, your politics is going to be corrupted. And that is the most important reason for having a genuine norm against anyone whom you can identify as a foreign agent. I speak to you as an American. I am raising issues, but foreign influence should be overt, and when discovered, you don't want them to have power. Of course, a foreign country can try to portray its genuine enemies as if, try to fool you into thinking that they are its agents. So you have a difficult problem because they're not going to, but the short answer is, it is an important question. My model ignored it completely. You're absolutely right. I will say, for example, I'm thinking about the history of the Dutch Republic and the early Dutch Republic. And the early Dutch Republic alternated between more decentralization to the representatives of the various provinces and more concentration of power in the stadtholder, was essentially the monarch of the Republic. And my reading of that history is that when power was concentrated in the hands of the monarch, it was easier for the King of France to bribe one person than it was for the King of France to subvert the politics of a more decentralized country. So it is certainly cheaper for the King of France, if he wanted to subvert the politics of one province than of the whole country. However, to subvert the whole country was easier in a concentrated political system than a deconcentrated one. That's my reaction to history. I think maybe I could make a model of that, but I have not. So I'm speaking off the cuff, but you raise a very important question.
Okay, so the next question was from here.
Hello. Could you, Dr. Myerson, could you comment on the adaptive, well, this decentralization could be, or federalization could be like should be a process, right? On the adaptive aspect of, if implemented in a country like Ukraine.
Yes.
Because for many concerns expressed is that, such process could look like as an experiment that could lead to like in Crimea in 1994, we had a couple of years long process to give an autonomy for one region, special powers that in the end led to the annexation. How to make it not be
I have argued that, let me say, as a foreigner just looking, I've argued in some ways it's very easy to decentralize power because there already are local provincial councils, and simply having, and the president of Ukraine has even discussed the option of without even a constitutional amendment, his making a promise to appoint whoever they choose to run the local administration. First of all, what is the local administration of a province or of an oblast or a rayon? The answer is there are some government offices in various parts of the country that are understood to be offices of a decentralized ministry, local offices of a national ministry that's part of the Prime Minister's cabinet, and there are other offices which are understood to be under the head of government of the province, and others that are understood to be under the head of government of the. But certainly if the Prime Minister and the President were of the same party, then it really didn't matter all that much which was which, and I believe that the different branches of public administration, some are categorized as national, some as provincial, some as district, rayon, those are probably rather arbitrary. Secondly, when you add up what's the budget of the province? Well, it's the sum of the budgets of those offices that are under the province. Is that the appropriate aggregate budget for so that's a really complicated question. That's a complicated technical question, and it must be sorted out. And it does. The real question ultimately is, what powers go to each level, and that's a complicated question, and how much budget. In most countries, I believe, and certainly in most countries I'm familiar with, in my country, municipalities and provinces live largely on their own tax revenue, but in most other countries that I'm familiar with, most revenue is to the national government, and then it's distributed. The rules for distribution for sharing national tax revenue with provincial and district levels government need to be clear and monitored. So the finance ministry needs to be operating according to transparent rules. The levels of those budgets need to be set. I've argued you should think in a healthy, decentralized system, somewhere between a third and half of the national spending, less than half, but more than a third of national spending would in aggregate be across the various municipalities, provinces, districts. And what's spent, on what is important, but that's the size. So that needs to be reorganized, and that does take time. Okay. Let me just say, in any decentralized system, there is tension between the politicians at the national level and the lower levels about power. And the rules of the system need to be respected. You can have constitutional courts, and you must. But the ultimate arbiters of those debates are the voters who are subject to both national and local administration, and to understand that a proper balance serves them well. That means that the most important cultural aspect of Ukraine is that Ukrainian citizens who have learned to appreciate the value of democracy need to appreciate the importance of hearing both national and provincial politicians argue about something. I want to say, on questions of a reform to decentralize this country, under the Constitution, appropriately, that's a decision made by national politicians. It's a vote of the Verkhovna Rada. But the opinions of people who have already been elected to provincial councils and district councils, I would argue, should be of interest. At least those thoughtful, patriotic individuals, of whom I'm sure there are many, who have been elected to provincial councils in any part of the country or district councils of any part of the country, should have opinions about decentralization. And in particular, a reform that pretends to decentralize power but actually puts a supervisor, who means that an agent of the national government is really going to have control. Those people are probably, those local politicians, locally elected officials are probably going to object to that. And I think the people of Ukraine should want to hear that debate. In fact, I would like journalists, if I want to say one thing to the people of Ukraine, to prepare yourselves for a federal system, start by asking what the news media, asking locally elected officials to please speak out and be part of the discussion about the crafting of a decentralization law. I, as a foreign professor, am interested in it, but the opinions you should want to hear, I think, are the opinions not only of national politicians, but people who have already been elected to local office. And that's the beginning of understanding, of being a citizen of a federal democracy, of wanting to listen to politicians at both levels on the questions of power sharing.
So we are unfortunately completely out of time. So I know there have been a couple of questions. So we will let Mr. Logos to conclude, and then we'll take those questions in private.
Can I just say, I've tried to talk about, as an economic theorist, about questions. These are questions I would have thought about had I not been excited, had not recognized the importance of Ukraine's political questions. But it is an enormous, the fact that these are important questions here is, to me, means that to the extent that I get to discuss them with you, there's nothing more important that I could do in my life than try to shed light on these, offer new ways of thinking about these questions. Your decisions and the people are what's important, but I hugely appreciate the privilege of talking with them here. They're theoretical questions about all societies, but to discuss them here where they are practical questions of real importance is an enormous privilege. Thank you. Let me turn over to you.
We'll have a chance to talk, I guess, off stage. I just want to remind a little bit of perspective, because I recall in 1992 the same question arose: to what degree should Ukraine decentralize? To what degree should there be a federal structure? And of course, the outcome of that was the Autonomous Republic of Crimea. And then when Yushchenko won the election in 2004, again the question came up of federalization. Yushchenko even raised the question of a bicameral parliament, where there would be a Senate which would represent regions, and there was a map of regions that he presented, remember, containing things like Halachina, Volyn, Slobozhanshchina, Dniepryanshchina, and so on and so on. So this is a perennial question, and I think, of course, this is the time when we need to address it. And it's very good to hear a debate, to look at different options, to analyze them, and in the end, to find some consensus. I just want to make a small announcement for those of you that are interested and excited in these issues. Tomorrow, the Kyiv School of Economics will be sponsoring two very important people from Slovakia, who in the period of in the last decade as Prime Minister and as Finance Minister carried out the horizontal and the vertical reforms that were needed to make the Slovak economy much more efficient, effective, and decentralized. And we're also able then to bring in a lot of foreign direct investment, making Czechoslovakia the biggest per capita producer of automobiles in Europe. So they'll be here tomorrow at 3 o'clock, Ukrainski Dim. Invite all of you to come. Today we were very theoretical. Tomorrow we'll look at the practical experience of a neighboring country where there's a lot of analogy. I think it'll be very, very, very interesting for you. So once again, Dr. Myerson, thank you very much. We truly appreciate your concern, your interest, your advice, the modeling aspect. I think we will continue to model. I think we'll be working with you, and I think the decision won't be made quickly, and perhaps it shouldn't be made in haste, but when it'll be made, hopefully it'll be the right decision that'll strengthen democracy and the economy in Ukraine. Once again, thank you very much, and we appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.